My name is Bill Marler. I'm the proud publisher of Food Safety News and also a foodborne illness lawyer for the last 30 plus years, based in Seattle, Washington. This outbreak was posted by the CDC April 14th. Interesting, the illnesses, the Salmonella outbreak, these illnesses started in early February and ran to early April. So I'm hopeful that we're seeing a small outbreak, that it's not going to be larger, but I would expect perhaps a few more people counted. Right now there's 12 people in 7 states, so it's very, spread out. The product went to some 30 states, primarily sold at Trader Joe's. The manufacturer of the product, or it's called the co-packer, is a company named Infinite Herbs out of Florida. So far there have only been 2 people of the 12 hospitalized. That's kind of typical when you see in a Salmonella outbreak. Usually you see less people hospitalized in a Salmonella outbreak than a E. coli outbreak. But that being said, there are over 1.3 million Salmonella cases every year in the United States. This just happens to be one of them, quite small. We certainly have seen Salmonella and E. coli outbreaks linked to fresh herbs, whether it's, parsley or cilantro or basil. We've seen those outbreaks. They're very difficult to control. These are very delicate, leafy greens. And so, people tend not to, wash them as vigorously as you would with romaine lettuce or other kinds of lettuces that have been known to be contaminated with E. coli or Salmonella. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge both in the growing, processing, and certainly for consumers using the product. It's not one that you'd normally think of as one that you would have to wash. But again, it just shows how important washing your produce really is. When people become ill in a Salmonella outbreak, and they're sick enough to go to the doctor, and hopefully a doctor will do a stool culture. Once though people have been getting stool cultures, and there were a handful of states that do a lot of investigation. One is Minnesota, and that actually has the most cases. That doesn't necessarily mean they have the most illnesses. They're just really good at catching them. And so when those cultures are done, they now are doing what's called whole genome sequencing. They're able to compare these people's salmonella that was found in their stools or sometimes their blood. They can compare the genetics, and they know that they share the same genetic fingerprint of that salmonella across 12 people from 7 different states. So it's really likely that that product that they consumed was what made them all sick. And so when the health department is investigating, finding out, where people were in the essentially 12 to 72 hours before the onset of their illness, they're finding out, oh, hey, look, the common denominators, they all shop at Trader Joe's. And guess what? They all purchased basil. And then that starts to triangulate back. And, likely Trader Joe's explained that Infinite Herb was their co-packer. And, we know that that other of Infinite Herb basil went to other stores. Whether or not illnesses are directly linked to that other store, we don't know. But that's essentially how local, state, the FDA and CDC work together to do that trace back, so they can pull that product off the market. When presented with the kind of evidence that the FDA and CDC and perhaps various state partners show these companies, they give them an opportunity to voluntarily recall. FDA does have authority to absolutely recall. That was given in the Food Safety Modernization Act. But again, they usually give companies, like, hey, we found it, and most companies are more than willing, and Trader Joe's did as well, pull that product off the market as quickly as the evidence suggests that basil was the likely source of these illnesses. So, it's a good thing. There have been in 30 plus years of doing food cases, I can really count on one hand how many times companies have refused to, recall products. Most of the time they do the right thing and the FDA doesn't have to force their hand. What to do in the future? I mean, we've seen these outbreaks happen again and again. It is a real challenge, when you're trying to keep, fresh produce, especially fresh, herbs, clean. I mean, and it really goes back to, where, frankly, the seeds that are being used, to how it's being grown, how it's processed. The whole goal here is to try to keep these pathogens that are primarily animal fecal pathogens, keep those pathogens off the product. And even when you try to keep it off the product, washing that product thoroughly. And, I think, one of the things consumers need to do is don't necessarily trust, prepackaged, pre-washed product, open it up and wash it again yourself. The whole idea is to, knock down the bacterial load. Our bodies, especially if we're, not too young and not too old, our bodies are going to be able to knock back most bacteria if the amount of that bacteria you're ingesting is relatively low. And that's why, you know, keeping hot things hot, cooking things, washing things thoroughly, keeping them cold, why that's so important and what consumers can do to help minimize the risk to our families. When a company has recalls, it's kind of a double-edged sword. On one hand, recalls without illnesses is a good thing. You want to get that product off the shelf if it is tested positive. Um, Frankly, though, Trader Joe's has had a lot of issues, and it's not just been pathogens. It's been rocks or stones or wood or all kinds of things like that. And I think, you know, if there were a couple, you could sort of chalk it up as, those kinds of things happen. But when you see that much and that much of a pattern, I would really question how vigorous they are in, policing their supply chain. A lot of times, stores, whether it's Walmart or Kroger or Whole Foods or, Trader Joe's, they sign contracts with their suppliers and say, it's got to be this price, it's got to be this way. And if something goes bad, it's your problem. And that's all well and good and, how it is, but you can't just rely on that contract. You have to, understand, who your supplier is and do they have, a food safety culture, because nobody's going to remember, that the basil came from Infinite Herbs. They're going to remember that it came from Trader Joe's. Just like all of the recalls, all of the problems, they're going to ring, oh, another Trader Joe's problem. So I think Trader Joe's sort of needs to up their, oversight of their supply chain. Can't just rely on lawyer-driven contracts. You gotta, make sure people, are paying attention. Some grocery stores deal with that by having smaller SKUs. So they have fewer items like at Costco. So they can really kind of core in on their supply chain. And that's one of the ways, they have tried to lessen the number of recalls and outbreaks linked to the products they use. When you have a store that has lots and lots and lots of items, it becomes a much bigger challenge. And so, but bottom line is, the points of sale, whatever it is, the restaurant, the grocery store, that's who the public's going to remember that made them sick. And so they have every reason to pay a lot more attention to the supply chain.